Hi, and welcome to the first November episode of Childhood Chapters. Today we are going to read the first chapter of Loki's Wolves by K.L. Armstrong and M.A. Marr. It looks really amazing, and I hope you like it.
Loki's Wolves by K.L. Armstrong and M.A. Marr. Chapter 1. Matt. Confrontation. Matt walked through the center of Blackwell, gym bag in hand, jacket thrown over his shoulder. It was dark now, with an icy wind from the north, but the cold felt good, blowing back his sweat-soaked hair. After 2 hours of boxing practice, he'd been tempted to take a detour and jump in the Nordstrom River, even if he had noticed ice on it that morning. Ice in September. Weird. Even in South Dakota, winter never came this early. A muscle spasmed in his leg, and he winced as he stopped to rub it. The upcoming tournament might be for charity, raising money to help tsunami victims in Hawaii. But Coach Ford still made Matt work as hard as he would before a title match. Matt started walking again, limping slightly. As much as he wished he could call for a ride, he knew better. He'd made that mistake last winter, when Coach had said a blizzard was coming. He'd gotten his ride and a lecture on how his brothers had never needed one, even when it was storming. He couldn't catch a lift with his friends either. That was worse, because it set a bad example. If Sheriff Thorson's boys weren't safe walking through Blackwell at night, who was? Matt was reaching down to rub his leg again when something moved in the town square. His head shot up, eyes narrowing. Outside the rec center, 2 kids climbed onto the weathered Viking Longship. Shields lined both sides as if invisible warriors rowed the old wooden boat, protection always within reach. A carved dragon arched from the hull. The kids were probably setting up a prank, trying to beat the one Matt had done with his friend Cody at Sigurblot, the spring festival. The parade had arrived at the Longship to find it covered in a tarp and making honking noises. Underneath the tarp, they'd discovered a flock of geese wearing little Viking helmets. Best prank ever, that's what everyone said. Unfortunately, Matt had to pretend he didn't have anything to do with it. If his parents had found out, well, they wouldn't ground him or anything. He'd just get the talk. How disappointed they were, how embarrassed they were, how much more responsible his brothers were. Personally, he'd rather be grounded. In a few more steps, he saw that one of the kids was a guy with shaggy brown hair that needed cutting and clothes that needed washing. With him was a girl. Her clothes weren't in such rough shape, but her blonde hair needed a trim just as badly. Fen and Lori Breck. Great. The cousins were always getting into trouble. Still, Matt told himself they really might just be pulling a prank, until he saw Fen wrench at one of the shields. There were a lot of things Fen could do, and Matt would just look away, tell himself it was none of his business. That wasn't always easy. Being the sheriff's kid meant he'd had lectures about vandalism since he was old enough to carve his name into a park bench. But this wasn't a park bench. It was an actual longship, something the people in Blackwell were really proud of. And there was Fen, yanking on it and kicking at it. As Matt's temper flared, his amulet flared with it. He reached for the silver pendant. It was in the shape of an upside-down hammer and almost as old as the longship. Thors' hammer. Everyone in Matt's family had one. Thorson wasn't just their name. They really were descendants of the Norse god. As Matt looked at Fen and Lori again, his amulet burned hotter. He was about to yell at them. Then he stopped and took deep breaths, sucking in cold air. He could hear his mother's voice. "You need to learn to control it, Maddie. I don't know why you have so much trouble with that. No other Thorson has this problem. Your brothers could handle theirs even when they were younger than you." Controlling his temper, and Thor's hammer, seemed especially hard around the Brecks. It was like the hammer knew they were related to the trickster god Loki. The cousins didn't know that, but Matt did, and he could feel it when he looked at them. Matt took another deep breath. Yes, he needed to stop Fen and Lori, but he had to be cool about it. Maybe he could just walk past, pretend he didn't notice them, and they'd see him and take off before they were caught. Fen spotted him. Matt continued walking, giving them a chance to sneak off. Being fair, his dad would be proud. Fen turned back to the longship and yanked on the shield again. "Hey!" Matt called. He didn't say it too loud, and he tried not to sound too angry. Just letting them know he saw them, giving them time to run. "Yeah?" Fen turned and stared straight at him, chin up, shoulders back. He was shorter than Matt, Skinnier, too. The only big thing about Fen was his attitude, which was always getting him into fights with larger guys, not that he seemed to mind. Lori stepped behind her cousin. Matt couldn't see her expression, but he was sure it matched Fen's. They weren't going to walk away. He'd been stupid to think they would. You shouldn't be doing that. Even as Matt said the words, he wanted to smack himself. It was exactly the kind of thing everyone expected the sheriff's kid to say. By tomorrow, everyone at school would have heard Fen and Lori repeat it with a twist of their lips and a roll of their eyes. Matt cleared his throat. It's an artifact, and it's really important to the town. Yeah, like that sounded better. Really important to your town, Fen said. Thorson town. Just don't do it, okay? But I want to, and if you want to stop me, Fen stepped forward, giving a grin that was all teeth, and for a second Matt thought he saw. Matt shook it off. Look, I'm just asking. The answer's no. Fen jumped out of the ship with a leap that would make an Olympic athlete proud. So what are you going to do about that, Thorson? Matt's amulet heated again. He took a deep breath. Cool it. Just cool it. He remembered something Coach Ford had said during practice. He'd been trying to teach Matt how to intimidate an opponent. You're a big guy, he'd said. Use that. It was hard for Matt to remember how big he was. At home, he only came up to his brother's shoulders. But he was the tallest kid in 8th grade. What am I going to do? Matt squared his shoulders, flexed, and stepped forward. Stop you. Something flashed in Fen's eyes, something cold and hard that made Matt hesitate, but only for a second. He finished his step, stopped in front of Fen, and pulled himself up to his full height. Lori climbed out of the ship and moved up beside her cousin. She leaned in and whispered something. Egging him on, Matt was sure. Fen waved her off. When she hesitated, he said something so low it was almost a growl. Lori looked at Matt, then backed into the shadows of the Longship. Fen moved forward. You think you can fight just because you've won a few in the ring? That's not real fighting. I bet you've never thrown a punch without gloves on. Then your memory sucks, because I'm pretty sure I beat the snot out of you and Hunter when you two ganged up on Cody. Fen gave a short bark of a laugh. That was what? 1st grade? I've learned a few things since then, Thorson. Matt took another step. He was sure Fen would back down. He had to. Taking on Matt was crazy. He hadn't just won a few in the ring. He'd made it all the way to the state championship. But Fen just planted his feet far enough apart to keep steady if he got hit. He wanted to fight. Really fight. Matt should have known that. Mom always said this is what got him into trouble. He never thought things through. If he got into it with Fen, his dad would. Matt inhaled sharply. He didn't even want to think what his dad would do. The power of respect. The power of authority. That's what let Thorsons walk through Blackwell at night. Not the power of violence. If he fought Fen Breck, his dad would haul him in front of the council and let them handle it. The humiliation would be worse than any punishment they'd order. You really want to do this? Matt asked. Fen cracked his neck, tilting it side to side, and said, Yeah, I do. Well, too bad. I've got a big match coming, and I need to save my strength for a real opponent. Matt started to turn. As he did, he heard a growl like a dog's, and he saw Fen lunge, eyes glinting yellow, teeth bared. Matt wheeled. The heat of the amulet flared in a wave of fury that turned his world red. He felt the power surge down his arm, heard the crackle, saw his hand light up, and tried to pull the power back. Too late. The white-hot ball shot from his hand and exploded with a boom and a blast of wind that sent Matt tripping backward. Fen flew right off his feet. He hit the Longship hard, his head whipping back, striking the side with a thud. Then he crumpled to the ground. Lori yelled something, but Matt couldn't hear the words. She raced to her cousin. Matt did the same. Lori dropped beside Fen, took him by the shoulder, and shook him. Fen groaned, his eyelids fluttering. Is he okay? Matt said, crouching beside her. She stood up, lifted her bag like she was about to slug him with it. You knocked him out. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. I don't know what kind of trick that was. Throwing that light thing to blind him before you hit him? You call that fair? She scowled. Exactly what I'd expect from a Thorson. I didn't... Whatever. Just go. Fen's not swiping anything tonight. She looked at him. Or do you want to call your dad to lock us up? Of course not. Matt swallowed. We should get him to the doctor. You think he can afford a doctor? I can. We don't need anything from you. Just go away, Lori snapped. But if he's... Go. Get out of here. He pushed to his feet and hesitated, but she was still glaring at him and Fen was coming too. Matt probably didn't want to be around when Fen woke up, so he mumbled another apology, backed away, and left them alone.
And that's it for the first chapter of Loki's Wolves by Armstrong and Marr. If you have come across the book and you thought, does this look interesting? I don't know. Let us know. Leave a comment, send us an email, and we will try to feature it on an upcoming Charlie Chapters. Have a good day.